I'd like to start by telling you the genesis of this. I call myself the accidental author. I am a retired special educator. I knew all my life that my mother was born in China, that my parents lived in China until 1952. So after the communist takeover, my father wrote a memoir for our family. It was completed in 1998. He passed away in 2010. He had no intention of this ever being published. It was just for the children and the grandchildren. A publisher in Shanghai found out about the manuscript and he said, this is a story that needs to be published. So we're going to talk both about the Jewish community that lived in Shanghai as well as my mother's Russian Jewish community that was in Harbin. There were three major Jewish communities in China. Tianjin is actually the port for Beijing. There were about 2,500 Jews living there at its peak. So talking about all three communities is another presentation. I'm going to focus today on the two communities that my family were an integral part of. Shanghai was an international city. As a result of the Opium Wars, it was an open port. The first community to grow in Shanghai, Jewish community, were the Baghdadi Jews. Some of you may be familiar with the Sassoons and the Kaduris. They were expelled from Baghdad. First, they went to Bombay, Italy. They started financial training schools with other Baghdadi Jews. They did their business in Judeo-Arabic, and they made their initial fortunes, unfortunately due to opium, but when the Chinese shut down the opium trade, they continued to trade in cotton and textiles and jute. Once they had established themselves, they started buying real estate. And in Shanghai and in Hong Kong, they owned some of the fanciest buildings, biggest buildings, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The Kaduri family actually in Hong Kong still owns the Peninsula Hotel Group and the CLP, China Light and Power. So there were a small number of German Jews who started to come before World War II to do business. Some of them had read the writing on the wall. The largest community of Jews in China were the Russian Jews. And the Chinese sold a concession to the Russians to extend the Trans-Siberian Railroad. It was called the Chinese Eastern Railroad that went through Harbin to Vladivostok. And this was my mother's family. This was the group she belonged to. And I think they may have topped out at maybe 30,000. Some people, again, made their fortunes, not my family, but it was about 4 decades a better place to be. There was the pogroms in Russia, there was the revolution, and Jewish boys were being inducted into the army for 25 years. So my grandfather ran away. Then came the Holocaust. Where was there left to go? As many of you know, countries, except for the Dominican Republic, were not issuing visas. One day my grandfather came home and said, I got a ticket to China. And my father was among the very first. He arrived in Shanghai in 1938, the end of November 1938. It was a 1-month journey by boat. People would take the train to Trieste or Genoa, actually Trieste mostly because that's Lloyd Trestino lines and Italian shipping lines would travel east from Trieste. So between 1938 and 1941, 20,000 Jews were saved by coming to Shanghai. And there was an entire yeshiva, the Mir Yeshiva, that I think Sugihara was involved with saving them, and then a portion of them came to Shanghai and survived the war there. That's my dad on the Conte Verde, one of the Lloyd Trestino boats in 1938. He was 18 years old. My grandparents brought him to the train station 2 days before they brought their daughter to the train station. My father was going to China. His sister was going to London. The British did issue visas to young women who agreed to be housemaids and nannies. The building over here, the embankment building, belonged to the Sassoons. The Baghdadi Jews knew what was happening in Europe, and they were prepared. They had a refugee reception center devoted. When people arrived, they sent these trucks down to the wharf or buses to bring them to the embankment building where they were given instructions. There was something called the Jaime, dormitories. They were given food ration coupons for the soup kitchens. And the poorest section of Shanghai was an area called Hangqiu, and I think now it's pronounced Hangpu. And this is Tangshan Lu. And this is the apartment where my father's brother-in-law and my father's sister lived from 1939 till 1947. I took this picture in 2019. Not a lot has changed in this neighborhood. They now have sinks in their front entryways, but they still do not have plumbing. And you see some air conditioners outside the window. But there was a Jewish hospital. There was Jewish schools. There was opportunity to live life safely. I've heard it said Shanghai was a great place to do business, not such a great place to live because of sanitation. Sanitation was really poor, but they all went to the Jewish hospital. They all got vaccinated. My dad had malaria a couple of times. My grandfather had dysentery, but they survived. What you see here is my uncle's ghetto pass. When the Japanese, after Pearl Harbor was bombed, the Japanese had been a presence in China since 1931. They started entering from the north. They came into Harbin in 1932. They were an interesting presence because they were there and they had some control, but it wasn't very organized. The day Pearl Harbor was bombed, it was Sunday in Hawaii, it was Monday in Shanghai. The Japanese came up the Yangpu River. They immediately took control. And they said all Jews who had come to China after 1937 had to live in the ghetto, in the Hangqiu ghetto, which was an area of 1 square mile. Many people were there already. My uncle was there. He married my father's sister. They had a baby in 1945. There were families there. My father was living in the French concession, which was a much nicer place to live. But by 1943, the Japanese said, everyone into the ghetto. There were no more extensions. So my father was able to actually bring his parents out of Vienna. He was actually able to bring his sister from London when war broke out in Europe. They were all in the Hangqiu ghetto. Crowded, unsanitary conditions. We have this gentleman to thank for a lot of the people who were saved. Dr. Hoffmann Lewanda was a diplomat from China living in Vienna. He had befriended Jewish families. When the orders came from Berlin, he reported to the Consul General in Berlin not to create travel documents for Jews. Well, you didn't need a travel document to enter Shanghai. It was an open port. Nobody had control. At least for the first couple of years, you could just come and you could stay and nobody would question it. But the Nazis required a ticket to somewhere and evidence that you could go somewhere. So he just started creating visas. The story is that he sat in a coffee house in Vienna and he issued, we don't know exactly how many he issued. We can say that he was responsible for thousands of lives being saved. And he never talked about it. My father never told me about it. Not until I had done research did I find out about Dr. Ho. He is among what we call the righteous among Gentiles. He is honored in Yad Vashem in Israel. And he told his daughter on his deathbed. He died in 1996, I believe. He was about that age. And he told his daughter what he did. And his daughter is continuing his memory and his legacy. So here's my father, 18 years old, all by himself in Shanghai. What's he going to do to make a living? Well, he started tutoring children because the one good fortune, the Nazis let him finish high school. He came with a gymnasium certificate that said he had finished high school. So he started teaching offering tutoring services to international families, even the family of 2 German boys. And he said if he was in Europe, he wouldn't have even been allowed to be near them. But this German father wanted his boys tutored, and he did it. He also sold advertising for XMHA. This was an American English language radio station. He picked up some money by selling advertising for them. As soon as the Japanese took control of Shanghai, this station had to close down. They were very anti-Japanese. So, what was it like? Well, this is 1940. My father actually has a private rickshaw that he shares with another woman who came from Vienna to get him to and from places. He said it was very hard to accept the fact that a human was doing this job. He said we soon realized that he needed the money. He said we usually paid double. We were guaranteed a rickshaw to be there when we needed it. It was clean. So this was something that they accepted over time. Now, this picture is in the Hangzhou ghetto. The Hangzhou ghetto became known as Little Vienna. There were restaurants, there were social events, there were educational events, there was entertainment. People tried to normalize their lives. Every Jewish child in Shanghai received an education, thanks to the Kaduris and the Sassoons. The Shanghai Jewish School, which my mother began to attend in 1940 when she was 12 years old, was started by the Sassoons and other Sephardim. There was the Gabais, the Ezras, other Baghdadi families. And the Kaduris, when the Shanghai Jewish School could not handle the population of refugees, they started the Shanghai Youth Association. I've actually met some people who said, oh, I went to the Kaduri school. And I had to find out what was the difference. I didn't know. My mother never had to live in the ghetto. This is my mother at age 16 at the Shanghai Jewish Club. If you were there before 1937, which her family had been in China since 1917 on her mother's side, 1919 on her father's side. And this is the Shanghai Jewish Club today. It's a music conservatory. A number of Jewish buildings have now become music conservatories. The population of Jews that came World War II were very instrumental in teaching Western music, which, as we know, was adopted by many Chinese. Meanwhile, what's Dad doing? This is the Shanghai American School graduation of 1946. He's all the way on the right on the faculty. During the Japanese occupation, my father kept the American school going. The headmaster was sent to internment camp. The Japanese had set up a number of internment camps, and he was taken to the internment camp. My father was holding classes for the students in private homes, working with the parents to, buy supplies and materials and teaching classes so that the class of 46 could graduate. This is what was at that time known as Aurora University. It's now called Fudong University. It's still one of the best schools, known as a law school. And my father really wanted to be an actuary, and he was very good in finance mathematics. And when the professor who was teaching that course left, he was asked to teach that course. So he did teach that course. The top picture is the graduating class of Aurora of 1946. Dad is in the back row to the right of that very tall man. That's a man named Joseph Tukura. He took that name. His name was Joe Tukashinsky, his Russian name. He became the Israeli ambassador to the United Nations, and Dad and him were competition for each other. What happens once the war is over, and it's 1946, Americans start coming back into Shanghai. And my father said the hope was that Chinese would be more Chinese than communist, that they would go back to this, which was a very colonial situation. And he admits throughout the book that a lot of what happened was not fair and not good. Judge Ullman, that's the nickname, N.F. Ullman, Norwood Ullman, had come to China in 1916 as a student interpreter. Actually, he had met Mao Zedong in the university in Beijing. And for, I think up until 1925, he was in the diplomatic service, and he hated it. He didn't like putting on, pretenses, but he loved China, and he was fluent in Mandarin, Cantonese, and they had a lot of big American clients, General Electric, Esso, Flying Tigers. So in 1946, when my dad graduated, Mr. Kopps's wife was a teacher at Ullman Kopps & Lee, and he said, go talk to my husband. And within 24 hours, he had a job as a factotum. He did everything. He learned about contracts. He put their money in the bank. So as things got worse under the communists, Judge Ullman, and the title judge was, there was a municipal court in Shanghai. If you were living in Shanghai as an expat, you were not subject to Chinese law. You were subject to the law of your country. So he served on the municipal court as representative of the United States. He also did a lot of work with the Chinese. So Judge Ullman approached my dad and said, I can't stay. A lot of American lawyers were ending up in jail. Could you take over the firm and close down the firm for us and our clients? And my father thought about it and said, this might be a good thing for me. He was being paid in American dollars. Half his money was being sent to a bank in Boston. The rest was being paid as salary in Shanghai. They promised him first-class passage to the United States, and this didn't go as easily as we would have hoped because the Korean conflict started, and the United States shut down the licenses to get money into China, and the Communist Party said, you cannot leave until you prove you've paid everyone. And a lot of people came out of the woodwork. Oh, this landlord, that. So my parents were stuck in China until February of 1952. My dad was working with a Chinese lawyer who had translated some legal documents that were in the public record into Chinese so that they could be sent to Judge Ullman because he was still doing business and settling things with clients. Dr. I was arrested the day before my parents left. And we don't know whatever happened. So that was very unfortunate. They lived a very colonial lifestyle, as you can imagine. This building, Hamilton House, this is what it looks like in 2019. It's very close to the Bund. In Shanghai today, this building is the old Shanghai Jewish Refugees Museum. It has been restored. Since I was there in 2019, it has been expanded considerably, I understand. And there's some pieces of silver that my parents received as wedding presents. They asked me if I had anything that I could donate, and I gladly did that. So this statue really tells about how the Jewish community felt. It's in front of the museum. It's on what was Ward Road on the edge of Hangzhou. The wonderful thing about the refugees coming to China is there was no anti-Semitism. And if you talk to any of the survivors of this community, they will tell you they felt fully accepted and lived in harmony, and there was a lot of love and respect. Ohel Moshe was built in 1927. When I wrote the first book, or edited the first book, I thought that's where my parents got married, because it said Ohel Moshe Synagogue. Well, then I looked at the address. The community, the Ashkenazi community, was doing well enough. In 1941, they built another synagogue. And there were at least 6 synagogues, and there were at least 4 cemeteries. There are no cemeteries left. All the headstones have been removed, and you will find some of them in walls, in streets. They're gone. But that's my mom and dad, my mother's mother, my father's mother. For those of you who would say, that's a Jewish wedding? Why are they holding candles? That's a Russian tradition to hold candles. And I didn't know that myself until I was at a Russian Orthodox wedding. So who were those Jews who ended up in Harbin? That's my mother's community. It came as early as 1898. The next significant influx was during Japanese War, 05 and 04 to 05. Now, the Japanese were told by the Germans when they joined the Axis to exterminate the Jews. And the Japanese wouldn't do it because that war in 04-05, Jacob Schiff, a Jewish banker, was somewhere that he met a Japanese general, and they said, we're running out of money to fight this war. And Jacob Schiff's family was still in Russia and suffering the pogroms. So he lent them money. So when the Germans told the Japanese, you really need to get rid of these refugees, they were like, I don't think so. We'll wait and see what happens. We might have a need. And then there was the largest wave came with the Russian Revolution. And that is my family story. Harbin was a fishing village until these Russians came and started trade. They built hotels. There was a Mars chocolate factory. My mother's uncle made his fortune fur trade. The reason the Japanese wanted Manchuria is it is extremely rich in natural resources. It's a very rich environment, and to this day. So when I visited in 2019, you can see this is a picture from when my mother was, well, actually that's 1931-32. So her baby brother was born. We think that was the street. Bolotnaya Street meets Swamp Street. If you do read the book, you'll see it was a very warm, loving community again, and very self-sufficient. Did not intermingle with the Chinese people a lot. It was a very insular community. If it was, other than the Jews, they were white Russians, monarchists, who had escaped the revolution. That's where the anti-Semitism was. That's where they still had it. But with the Chinese, they did live in peace. So there is an island in the middle of this, they called it the Sungari River. I think it's now the Sunghao River. And they went in the summertime. Now Harbin, some of you may have seen the pictures of the ice festivals. That didn't happen back then. It's crazy cold, like 40 degrees below zero. But in the summertime, it gets up to 80 degrees. So they used to go to the dachas and have a lovely summer. My mother would talk about the Chinese farmer feeding his horses and going to the farmer to get sunflower oil and eggs. And Russian school didn't start till age 7. It was a Russian Jewish school. And the building that has been restored, that's it over there, is also a music school for children now. That was the oldest synagogue, which that one was destroyed but rebuilt, and this is the bima, or the altar, of that synagogue. There is a man, an Israeli, named Dan Ben Canaan, or Canaan. He met his wife, a Chinese woman, and they went back to Harbin, and he says he's the only Jew in Harbin, and most probably he is. But he worked with the government of Harbin to restore 3 buildings: the school, the old synagogue, and the new synagogue. So this is a photo that I just found in my family's collection. This is the chief rabbi of Harbin, Rabbi Kislev. I think this picture has been photoshopped. Because even back in the 20s and 30s, they knew how to do that. See how some of the heads sort of kind of don't fit the bodies? So what people did was, if they couldn't be at family gatherings, Photoshop them in. This is my grandparents, my grandmother and my grandfather, who were married in Harbin in 1924. I provided these photos to Dan Ben Canaan, and he had been documenting the history of this community. He said, I heard this story, but I never saw proof of it. This is a matzah factory. If you look closely, there are sheets of matzah on this table. What they did was they cleaned up an area, they put up a canopy, they brought out there, you can see it being rolled out every Passover, and my grandmother, I'm told, volunteered to do this because then she got free matzah for the rest of the holiday, for the 8 days. Again, this community really pulled together. Here is the Jewish hospital. Here is the soup kitchen and home for the aged. This is what the building looks like today. I believe this might be one of these buildings is an eye hospital. One of the new synagogue, the one that was built after the one you saw, is a museum. And this photograph was in the museum, showing about the opening day of the soup kitchen and home for the elderly. Some people, I told you, made a fortune. Joseph Kasper built the Hotel Modern. It is still there being used. A lot of Russians travel to Harbin, and it looks very much like a Russian city. It has a lot of Russian food. It is being used today, and they have some display cases. I took this picture because the menorah, look what's in the picture with it. King Tut. As I said, the Jewish cemeteries were destroyed. And in Harbin, there is one foreigner cemetery. There are other groups of people. There's a Buddhist area in this synagogue, in this cemetery as well. But when you enter through the gate for the Jewish cemetery, there's this very big granite Jewish star. This is the maintenance building. They built it to look like the old synagogue. There are about 800 tombstones there. In 1958, the government said, if you send us $50, we will move your relatives' remains. According to Dan Ben-Canaan, he says, maybe the stones moved. I don't think the remains moved. There were over 2,000 Jewish headstones. And as I said, many of them you'll find in walls, in roads. But we did visit. These are my parents. That's our Buddhist goddess. This was a wedding present that my parents received. She's silk, and she's now under glass. My parents didn't put her under glass. I don't know why. All the photographs of our family gathering, she's always there. She's traveled through the family through time. I thank you very much for your attention, and if there are any questions, I'd be happy to take them right now.
Do you know anyone who ended up in Japan?
Yes, actually one of your neighbors here, she lives in the Northwest here, wrote a book called Stateless in Shanghai. Her name is Lillian Willens. She's 98 years old now, and I tried to get in touch with her. I've seen her last time 6 months ago, but her book is another good story. But her parents came to Harbin. She was born in 27, and she was the second of three daughters, and they went to Shanghai quickly. Her father lied about his nationality. He didn't, because the Russians came into Harbin as late as 1945 looking for deserters. And he said he was Romanian. Well, guess what? There were no quotas for Romanian. So her mother said she was Russian, and Lily was more than 21 years old. Her older sister was also, they did not fall under their parents' jurisdiction. Her sister married an American soldier, but Lily was the administrator of the race course. I don't know, there was a big race course. It's now the People's Park in Shanghai. This was used by all the different social clubs, the British, the French, and there were like athletic fields in the center where you could play tennis. And her mother and her younger sister got a quota number. She and her father did not. So some friends got together, and she was, after 1951 this was though. I think it's Kobe, Japan, where there was a community of people. And then there was at one point where Jews were just shipped out of Shanghai, and I think they were sent to the Philippines. There was a group of people who ended up in the Philippines.
I wonder if you can just expand like more, like what was her move like?
Oh, well, my mother was born in Harbin. How did her parents come?
Right.
Her parents, her mother was a child who came by train with her father and mother and some of her siblings. Her three oldest sisters stayed behind in Russia because they were married already. But they came on the train legally. Anyone who left Russia was stateless. They had no papers. My grandfather, and if you read the book, as far as I'm concerned, that's the best part of the book, he just left his family. And my mother and her brother knew nothing about it. He never spoke of his parents. He never spoke of his siblings. In 2016, a man called my brother's law office and said, "I'm your mother's first cousin." And it was like, really? We have no connection with anyone. He says, yes, I'm a Soviet Jew who left St. Petersburg in 1979, and I live 5 miles away from me for the last 34 years. So I met him in a restaurant with his wife, and we changed stories. It was like, who knows? And he came to my house, and I put out all the family pictures, and he went, my uncle, my aunt, my uncle, my father, my grandfather, all were on my dining room table, and I did not know this. So my grandfather was the oldest of 8, and not until I did the research for this book, through talking to people, I now have some friends in Shanghai, they said, have you spoken to Katya Kanasneva? She's a professor in Italy, and there's an archive in Khabarovsk. She found an archive of 11 pages of information about my grandfather. I never knew anything about this until researching these books.
You mentioned Jewish in Shanghai feel mostly accepted. Because I wonder how the interaction look like with local Chinese people. Like,
if you speak to this community of refugees, they will tell you that they loved their ammas. Their ammas were wonderful. They took them to the market. They took such good care of them. Peter Max, the famous artist. So this was their main connection. Chinese ammas spoke Pidgin English and Shanghainese. So there was some communication. There was some intellectual friendships. So Ullman, Copps, and Lee, Mr. Lee was Chinese, James Lee, he had to leave before my father left. He was married to a wealthy woman. He was not going to be accepted in communist society, and he had to leave because, you know, the reign of terror started. My parents was there when the reign of terror started. Actually, my father's boss was a very good friend of Chiang Kai-shek. His wife went to college together, went to Wesleyan University together. So they were great friends. There's a book, Judge Ullman wrote a book called Shanghai Lawyer. And it's an interesting book, and my publisher has since brought out a new edition with a lot of notes and pictures and explaining a lot of situations. Again, there was an understanding and a communication, and there were relationships.
I'm curious about, like, how do you perceive with your family navigating so many moves, like migrations, and how does it like come into your like identity?
Very, very, very important. I grew up in New York City. As a child, the World's Fairs were happening. All the people who had left Europe, had left China, would visit us. And my friends would say, oh, you're like the United Nations, because people from Brazil, from Australia, from New Zealand. My family alone, my father's cousins went to New Zealand, to Palestine, and then my mother's family, my mother was a Zionist. The Harbin was a hotbed of Zionism. And so when I think about why there was not more intermingling with the Chinese culture, and I put it in the book that diaspora defined us. This was just a stop on the road. But I am so grateful to my parents for exposing me to every culture, you know, whether it was Chinese friends or Russian friends or Austrian friends or German friends. We were always open to it. My mother, you know, yes, we were Jewish, but my mother would take me to see friends' Christmas trees, and she was always open to, this is a big world. And my parents sent me at a young age. My father was originally International Trademark Counsel for General Electric and then Trademark Counsel for the entire company. And I was lucky enough when I was 14, I stayed with his British associate. When I was 16, I stayed with his Spanish associate. I went to school in Israel once the summer I was 19. So it was always very important. One of my regrets is my father and mother could only speak English to each other. So I've got some German in my head and some Russian in my head. And my mother actually learned Japanese in school because when the Japanese took over, they put Japanese teachers in the schools. So they did not have really an opportunity to learn Chinese. In the Jewish schools, they were learning Hebrew, and in Harbin, they were taught in Russian. And in Shanghai, they had to switch over to English so that they could all learn together. But her Hebrew wasn't bad. She could read Hebrew. So very important to me. And I love the city. It feels better than a lot of other places. It's just so enriching.
I wonder how many went to Israel.
I don't have exact numbers, but among my mother's community, they were she belonged to a group called Beitar, which were revisionist Zionists. She learned how to fire a gun, she wore a uniform, they were going to fight for the state of Israel. There was a Displaced Persons Act that actually expired in June of '51, because I have the letters of Judge Ullman writing to congressmen saying, please extend this Displaced Persons Act, because I have my proxy in Shanghai. He has a wife, she is pregnant, and the displaced persons numbers are going to expire in June of '51. And they didn't get out till February '52. So a good portion, my aunt and uncle and their young son and many others were on American transport ships that left in '47 and '48, and they went to San Francisco. That part of the family went to Boston because my grandfather's youngest brother had met the daughter of Secretary of State Morgenthau the summer of '37, and he wrote to her and said, we need to get out. So one uncle was here, and he then ended up sponsoring people and came to the Boston area. My grandparents, my father's parents, had to go through displaced persons camp. They left from Shanghai, went to Tianjin, Japan, Hawaii, through the Panama Canal, to Italy, to Bavaria, and they were in displaced persons camp in southern Germany before they were allowed to enter the United States. So this was now 1950, 1951. My parents got out in '52. They went to Hong Kong. My father finished some business in Hong Kong in a week. Then they boarded a boat to Marseille, 1 month to get back to Marseille. He had been told that the visa bureau was in Milan. Well, they got to Milan. It was like the Thursday before Easter, and they said, nope, Genoa, wrong place. He had started applying for a visa, I think, in '46. He had all the documents documenting, and then he had to put my mother on his Austrian passport. His passport was reinstated. So my brother's born, so what are they going to do? My brother's born in Vienna. Then they leave for Italy because they're told their papers are ready. They get to Italy, and my mother's taken aside, and they say, do you know who Avram Frolov is? And she says, that's my father's name. Where is he? Well, he died in Israel in 1951. Because my uncle, her younger brother, was on a transport from Shanghai into the IDF. After my parents got married, March of '50, my grandparents had their papers extended to stay for the wedding. So by '51, they were in Israel. So the person in the consulate said, there's a communist union leader in San Francisco named Avram Frolov. She said, well, that's not my father. Well, it was the McCarthy era. It took another 5 months to get their papers because of this incident. So they were in Europe for a year waiting for their papers. There was a Russian community. I said, well, most Russians were stateless. The Russians gave people the opportunity to have a passport, but it was a one-way ticket back to the Soviet Union. Many of those people who took advantage of that ended up in the gulags. So when my father met my mother, he went to the Austrian embassy. He had her put on his passport and put her Soviet identification card in the embassy mailbox. But he was worried every time. They wouldn't register my brother's birth in Vienna because, after the war, the Allies had control of the cities. They rotated. They said it was illegal for him to be married to a Soviet citizen. She said, he's not a Soviet citizen. She's on my passport. Eventually, he most probably paid the official under the table to register my brother's birth. So there were a few hundred Russian stateless people who were in Shanghai till 1957. The last synagogue closed in 1957. And there was a diplomat, I believe in Singapore, who just became the Good Samaritan. Somebody said, listen, these people are stuck there. Give them papers, and they finally got out. And I attended a webinar with this woman named her last name is Cunningham. Her family owned pharmacies. They were one of the wealthy families in Harbin, in Shanghai, and she has asked for restitution, and there's no restitution coming. She said people left in 57. Now, Dan Ben-Canaan documents that the last Jewish family, the Podolskis, left Harbin in 1963. And there was one elderly woman who lived in the attic of the synagogue. She died in 1985. At that time, the government took all the records of the Jewish community, sent them to Beijing, and they are unavailable. Dan had me sign a power of attorney because before I told you that story about my grandfather, I knew nothing about him. And I said, when did my grandfather arrive? What did he do for, and he said, maybe if you give me a power of attorney, they'll release some information, and it never happened. What a great audience. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.